Our second lesson today comes from Matthew chapter 17, verses 1 through 9, which can be found on pages 18 and 19 in the New Testament in your pew Bibles. Much like the song that we heard earlier, Follow the Drinking Gourd, many of our passages in the New Testament or Second Testament have clues in them, references to other stories. So I invite you to listen with new ears as you hear this story, paying attention to the clues that might be hidden within. Let us listen for God to speak. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and his brother John and led them up to a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. And his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." And while he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my Son, the Beloved, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up. And do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. And as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. It is likely that we all have had times in our lives when something happened to us that defies explanation, and it resets our understanding or our perception of the world and our place in it. Maybe we saw something or discovered something for the very first time, or we experienced something in a brand new way, in a manner we had never experienced before, or we witnessed something that literally changed everything for us. You are familiar with those moments when you are left in disbelief with your eyes wide open and your mouth agape. Those instances when you realize that you had been holding your breath all along and didn't know it. And maybe you said to yourself, or perhaps out loud to whoever was close enough to hear, "What just happened? Are you kidding me? I can't believe I just saw that." And as a result, you're left wondering what you're supposed to do with this new information, this new realization. And you considered maybe for the first time whether things would return to what you understood as normal ever again. And you were right to think such things, because that event, whatever it was, changed you. Changed the way you saw the world, changed the way you experienced your life, and things might not ever return to how you once understood normal, but things would be new. Transcendent experiences are like that. After such experiences, we get up and we move into what comes next, having experienced a metamorphosis, having been changed, transformed before our own eyes. The mysterious story of the Transfiguration is such an event for the disciples and, by extension, for all of us. And this Transfiguration Sunday is a day when we reflect on the mystical moment on the mountain when 3 of Jesus' disciples experienced his appearance change, transformed before their eyes. Not only does this story and this day invite us to consider the mysterious and mystical event and others that we may have experienced for ourselves, it also prepares us prepares us for the journey ahead of us through the 40 long days of Lent. Now, before we get into the text itself, I would like to go backward in the story to find its context. So just before our reading this morning, we read about an important exchange between Jesus and his disciples, where Simon proclaims Jesus to be Messiah, the Son of the living God. And this proclamation, as you may remember, inspires Jesus to change Simon's name. He will now be known as Peter, which means rock, the original rock. And because of his pronouncement of Jesus as Messiah will prove to be the foundation upon which the church will be built. And immediately following that event, according to the author, is yet another exchange between Jesus and his followers. In this instance, Jesus tells them that he was heading to Jerusalem, where he would face suffering and would die, but 3 days later would be raised again. The recently renamed Peter is offended by Jesus' words. He takes Jesus aside and he rebukes him. And as a result, the one who had just made the messianic proclamation was now called Jesus' adversary, Satan. Jesus said that Peter was not setting his sights on divine things and was only seeing things through human eyes. Jesus then went on to tell his followers that they too would face adversity as a part of their discipleship and devotion. All of this is the context immediately prior to our text this morning. And it sets the stage in the Gospel of Matthew for this event that we have come to know as the Transfiguration. Without it, we miss how it fits into the larger narrative of the text. So now our text. In it, we find Jesus, the one who was just proclaimed to be Messiah, anointed one, going up on a mountain with his inner circle of 3 disciples, Peter, recently renamed Peter, James, and John. Now, whether the events actually happened exactly in this order or in this way or not matters little. But the author of Matthew tells it this way for a reason. We are told that the 4 men went up on the mountain together in much the same way that Moses ascended a mountain into the very presence of God, surrounded by a cloud to receive the law. And in the same manner in which the prophet Elijah went up on a mountain to escape persecution and there encountered the divine in a gentle whisper, reminding him that he indeed was not alone on his journey. Now, our 4, Jesus, James, John, and Simon Peter, ascended. And when they reached the summit, the story focuses on the disciples' experience. The author tells us that the disciples perceived Jesus to be transfigured before them. They saw Jesus' face shine in the same manner that the face of Moses shone when he had encountered God. And then, appearing to the disciples, the text says, were Moses, the liberator of the people, and Elijah, a prophet who anointed kings and prophets and was expected to return before the coming of Messiah. They appeared as though they were talking to Jesus. Peter, the one who, according to our text, had just been called the rock, and the adversary, nearly in the same breath, wanted to stay there. He, like us, desired to capture this transcendent moment and live in it as long as they possibly could. However, much to his dismay, the scene abruptly changed again. A familiar voice could be heard from a cloud that descended around them, saying, "This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." Words spoken as a reminder to his followers of the words heard at Jesus' baptism. This time, the sound of these words drove the 3 disciples to the ground because of fear. To me, that makes total sense. Who could blame them? And then, here's what I think may be the most important part of the text, or at least the most powerful. Then, Jesus comes and touches them. He touched them. The same hands that touched the leper, that healed the blind man, and raised the young woman from the dead, now tenderly touched them. And with his touch, Jesus said, "Get up," or literally it means be raised. It is the same word that the author of the Gospel of Matthew uses over and over again for resurrection. As he touched them, Jesus said, "Be raised, and do not fear." With that, they found themselves alone in the company of Jesus. What to do? The story says that they then descended the mountain, uncertain as to what just happened, uncertain of what might be next. They descended with the experience, their lingering questions, and Jesus' words dancing in their hearts and in their minds. And in spite of, or maybe because of all of this, they came down the mountain together and moved toward whatever it was that they were to face. And they did so transformed, transfigured, changed by what they had just seen, experienced, and heard. And upon descending, the text goes on and tells us that they immediately began their journey toward Jerusalem. And they were confronted by the needs of those around them again. For when they reached the bottom of the mountain, Jesus was called upon once again to heal someone who had been tormented by dis-ease. So that's our story. You may be asking, why this story this week before the beginning of the season of Lent? Well, here at the start of these long 40 days of prayer, fasting, self-examination, and preparation, I think we need this message. Okay, I'll confess, I need this message. For what lies ahead of us are deserts and wells and the dangers of unexpected places and spaces. The way before us may bring difficult nights of the soul and unwelcome news. In the coming weeks, we will definitely feel the sting from the stories of betrayal, desertion, and what may seem like separation and desperation. In the next 40 days and 40 nights, we will need to put ourselves in the place of the early disciples, for this journey that is ahead of us can be tiresome and challenging. We need to hear the voice they heard from the clouds, reminding them of who accompanies them along the way. And this is also the reminder we need as we face what may come our way at the bottom of the mountain. So may we hear these words. "This is my child, the beloved, For even in the midst of the deepest struggle and bleakest moments that we may face, these words can provide us hope. For we too are the beloved of God, and nothing can ever change that truth. May we also hear these words. Listen to him. These words form an imperative to not just hear the words of Jesus, but to be transformed by them. They are a part in themselves of the transfiguration. So may these words somehow grant us the faith and the courage to follow the words of Jesus and the way of Jesus, bringing good news to the poor and release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, and freedom for the oppressed and marginalized. If our experience of transfiguration, transformation, remains only at the top of the mountain and doesn't lead to the transfiguration and transformation of the way we live with our neighbors, then it's only an ecstatic personal experience. And I think the world needs much more than that. May we also feel Jesus' touch and hear the words, "Be raised, and do not fear." Is there any more hopeful or hope-filled message that we could hear than that? In our time and our world full of conflict, violence, division, uncertainty, and an seemingly endless news cycle full of despair, we need to hear this coming from the lips of the one who promised to be with us. Be raised, and do not fear. This is not something of our own doing. It is echoed throughout the Scriptures over and over again as the activity of the divine in our world. The one who the ancient poets imagined as breathing the breath of life into our being. The one the prophet saw animating the valley of dry bones. The one who commanded a friend to come out of the tomb. The one who left the linen burial cloths behind and appeared to Mary Magdalene in the garden, says to his disciples of all time, "Be raised, and do not fear." Do not fear. Not because there's nothing to be afraid of, but because of the presence of the one who accompanies us into and through and out of each and every one of our days. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, theologian, pastor, anti-apartheid, and human rights advocate, wrote about transfiguration as he reflected on some of the most difficult days of apartheid. At a meeting with other church leaders in winter, he writes, "The grass was pale and dry, and nobody would have believed that in a few weeks' time it would be lush and green and beautiful again. It would be transfigured. As I sat quietly in the garden," the Archbishop wrote, "I realized the power of transfiguration, or of God's transformation in our world. The principle of transfiguration is at work when something so unlikely as brown grass that covers our fields in winter becomes bright green again, or when the tree, gnarled, leafless branches bursts forth with the sap flowing so that birds can sit chirping in leafy branches. When winter gives way to spring and nature seems to experience its own resurrection. The principle of transfiguration says nothing, no one, and no situation is untransfigurable. All over this magnificent world, God calls us to extend God's kingdom of shalom, peace, wholeness, of justice, of goodness, of compassion, of caring, of sharing, of laughter, of joy, and of reconciliation. God is transfiguring the world right this very moment through us because God believes in us and because God loves us. And he continued, as we share God's love with God's children, there is no tyrant who can resist us. no oppression that cannot be ended, no hunger that cannot be fed, no wound that cannot be healed, no hatred that cannot be turned to love, no dream that cannot be fulfilled. So friends, may we be transfigured, transformed, changed, not through effort or as a result of our own desire, but because of what God has done, is doing, and will continue to do in and through the world, in and through us. May we be transfigured, transformed, changed, not simply for our own sake, but for the sake of the entire world. May we be transfigured, transformed, changed, not just on the mountaintops, but in the deepest valleys. Friends, be raised and do not fear to be transfigured. To God be the glory. Amen.